Russell Targ is a laser physicist, author, motorcycle enthusiast, and ESP researcher. We're delighted to have him back at Contact in the Desert. He's here to present data from his time at the Stanford Research Institute and his collaboration with the CIA's Stargate Psychic Spine program. So without further ado, Russell, welcome back to Contact in the Desert.
I'm very happy to be with you. I'm always happy to have an opportunity to describe the exciting time we had at Stanford Research Institute during the Cold War. My job as a physicist was to explore the limits, if any, of the remote viewing that was appearing during that period. We're working for the CIA and for NASA, and everyone was very excited that people in the laboratory seemed able to describe what was going on in distant places. That was especially interesting to the CIA, as you might discover. And what we found, the most interesting thing we found, is that people are able to quiet their mind and describe and experience what's going on at a distant location. And we call that ability remote viewing. And we found that most people could do it. We had some very talented people, but by and large, anybody who walked into my laboratory was able to do remote viewing pretty well. So it's not limited to a special few people. And the most interesting thing we discovered from a year of working is that the accuracy and the reliability of the remote viewing does not degrade as you look further and further away. That is, we did a lot of activity, psychic hide and go seek, where the subject would sit with me in the laboratory and other people, the general, the colonel, my partner, Hal Putoff, would go hide someplace. And I would say, here we are, John, we're ready to go. Tell me about the surprising images that show up in your awareness.
So there was no aptitude test that you ran first and sort of give you an idea of a person's ability to do this?
In the beginning, we thought that it would be limited to a special few. By the end of the program, we were working with 6 Army recruits that I just chose off the floor of the gymnasium, and they were significant at odds of 1 in a million. So people were very surprised at the good results we had in general. But the important result is that in terms of modern physics, we would call remote viewing a non-local ability. It's definitely independent of the distance. In our experiments in the beginning, we would have people describe, where are you hiding in Palo Alto, as I sit in the laboratory in Menlo Park. And that worked very well. And Ingo Swann was able to look into a future atomic bomb test in China. And he could say, we of course didn't know it was a bomb test. All we're given is coordinates. Here you are, Ingo, tell us what's going to happen at this location 3 days from now. And he said, I see a pyrotechnic display in the sky, and there are a line of trucks, beautiful pyrotechnics. I need colored pencils, I'll draw that. That was enough to tell the CIA that the bomb test they were interested in would take place but would fail. So Ingo had no problem describing what's going on 3 days in the future, 10,000 miles away. We had a program based on an ESP teaching machine that I invented, and I showed that to Werner von Braun before the program got started, and it was von Braun's very excellent performance with my ESP game that allowed me to meet the administrator of NASA, Jim Fletcher, and got the program started. And you can have my ESP teaching machine free from the Apple Store. It's called ESP Trainer. You can download that and play with it or use it. But the ESP teaching machine was the key to starting our program. What we found with Ingo is that although he could look in China and see into the future, one day when we had our program to teach people how to improve their scores with the ESP teaching machine, my NASA contract monitor asked Ingo, can you take a look at Jupiter? We're going to be having a flyby with the Pioneer leaving shortly. What do you see new in Jupiter? And Ingo said, well, as I take a puff on my cigar, it looks to me like there's a interesting ring of ice crystals all the way around the planet. And George said, oh, you must be thinking of Saturn. And Ingo said, I've been looking at the solar system my entire life. You got to believe me, I know the difference between Jupiter and Saturn. And indeed, 8 months later, when they got pictures back from Jupiter, Ingo was the first person in the world who knew there was a ring of ice crystals around it. And the point of my story is that he had no more trouble describing something 500 million miles away than he did to describe something across the street in Menlo Park or 1,000 miles away, 10,000 miles away in China. The distance did not matter, and the physicists were confident it didn't matter. But there were other people who investigated things, and we had enough data. So we're now even though I'm a physicist, I can still make the outrageous claim that consciousness permeates everything. Now, it doesn't sound like a physics statement, and I'm only a slightly reconciled logical positivist. So that means I really have to see the data, and I'm a reformed logical positivist because I no longer feel I have to burn the believers. That was only in college. But the idea that consciousness permeates everything means that no matter how large or how small your consciousness can be there. And we actually have evidence to go with the 500 million mile case. In the early 1900s, some theosophical researchers, Madame Blavatsky, who was the head of the Theosophical Society, was also a highly intelligent psychic woman, said, we're now hearing a lot about the periodic table. I think you two, naming Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater, two world famous psychics at the time, why don't you take a look at some atoms and we can make a psychic periodic table? Isn't that an interesting idea?
Yes.
What does it look like psychically? So Leadbeater got a block of paraffin, because paraffin is 99% hydrogen. And he said, as I look at this paraffin, I see these two intersecting triangles representing the hydrogen. And in the corner of each triangle, there's a ball. And I think that's like a fundamental atomic mass in the corner of those. And the balls are held together by bands of energy. And that's what he drew at the beginning of the 20th century. 65 short years later, people began to talk about quarks and gluons. So on the right side of my slide, I show a 21st century drawing of a hydrogen atom, has two up quarks and a down quark connected by gluons. So 100 years after Leadbeater is describing the fundamental atomic units held together by energy, we now have gotten so well educated that they're actually called gluons and quarks. That's the advance we made. But the point is, Leadbeater was the kind of person who could see anything all over the universe, including down to atomic levels. And this is a published document I got this from the Lucifer magazine, which is a theosophical journal published in 1895, because I wanted to have the original. And so in 1895, see, the proton wasn't discovered until 1919 by Rutherford. So this was, quarks were a century away, but the drawing that Leadbeater made greatly represents what was going to be appearing in books 100 years after he drew that. So that was a remarkable piece of microscopic remote viewing. So it gives you the idea that his consciousness indeed permeates everything. There is no known limit to what you're able to see. So as a physicist, I spent my life doing laser. I'm basically a laser guy. I spent 15 years before my mid-course correction to remote viewing, doing laser stuff. I was the pioneer with the laser. And after I left remote viewing, I was putting lasers on airplanes. I created a remote sensing laboratory at Lockheed. And what we were remote sensing is invisible wind shear and air turbulence. And I could use a powerful laser to see the invisible wind shear. So I've been looking for invisible stuff my whole life. And what we know now, though, the point of this idea is that psychic functioning is not weak and unreliable. Psychic functioning is powerful. And as you'll see in a bit, it was reliable and we could use it for all sorts of things. But here in my little introduction, we're able to use remote viewing to see 500 million miles to Jupiter or all the way into a block of paraffin to see the atomic structure. And this is data that exactly corresponds to the contemporary drawings of a hydrogen atom.
Now, do you know, did NASA ask Ingo Swann if he would take a look at other bodies such as the moon or Mars?
Not as far as I know. We weren't doing that. This was just a one-off. Pesderz was very supportive of our program, and he was just hanging out with me and Ingo, playing with the ESP teaching machine, which you'll see shortly. And he said, by the way, we're about to launch the Pioneer. Would you take a look at Jupiter? Ingo said, sure, I would. And I'll show you that in a little bit. So here are the four musketeers. You got two laser physicists, a guy from the CIA, and the most psychic person in the world. I bet your ESP allows you to tell who those people are without any further ado. The guy on the left is my colleague, Hal Puthoff. He's a laser researcher, PhD from Stanford. The guy with the sunglasses, of course, is CIA contract monitor, Kit Green, who is very supportive of our work. As a physician, head of LSD, that is to say, the life science division at CIA. This leaning tower is me 40 years ago. And the guy on the right is Pat Price, the most psychic man in the world at that time. And we're standing in front of a glider or near a glider that we were going to fly around to see if Pat Price was able to see things from inside the glider. And of course, he had no trouble doing that. So here we are in one of our peaceful meeting rooms. The guy on the left is Robert Monroe, who wrote Journeys Out of the Body. And Bob and I were friends before this program because I was interested in this out-of-body research. In fact, I have a lifetime interest in psychic abilities. As a teenager, I was on the stage doing pretend magic. And I did that until I realized that from time to time on stage, I would have a correct impression of the life stream of somebody I was talking to in the audience. And as a young scientist, I became more interested in the real data of parapsychological research than in fooling people doing tricks on the stage. But our contract monitors were very happy that I had a background in magic because they felt that I was less likely to be tricked by a visiting magician. So that all went very well. So Bob Monroe was interested in our work because the remote viewing he felt was very much like the out-of-body experience, and we agreed with that. In remote viewing, we were eager for a person to simply quietly describe what's going on in the distance. I did not want my remote viewer to separate her consciousness from her body because I'm not qualified to help somebody get reintegrated. And it would be the end of our program if our viewer went to the management and said, Targ separated my consciousness from my body and I'm not able to get integrated again. That would just be the end of the remote viewing program. So we were very sanitary in the effect I would ask people to see, tell me what you see on your mental screen. But with experienced viewers, I would go with them and we could have a trip and describe together what was going on. It's as though remote viewing is on a continuum where the nice sanitary remote viewing we did at SRI is my asking you to quiet your mind and tell me about the surprising images that appear. Those are the magic words. I don't say, where is hell, or what's the object, or what's going on. I say, we have a target today. Tell me about the surprising images that appear in your awareness. And by the way, you can't do that wrong because only you know what's in your awareness. So it was a very friendly, unchallenging thing. So people felt quite comfortable, like I'm not asking them to do something crazy. I say, close your eyes and you will see some interesting image. Tell me about it. That doesn't sound too hard. And it's not too hard. So there's a continuum from looking on the psychic screen to going to a distant place where you bring with you your emotionality, your sensitivity, your sexuality, whatever you're comfortable with. We can do that with an experienced viewer, but we don't want to scare our newcomer. But there is a continuum, and Bob Monroe understood that. In fact, he wrote about sex on the astral plane in his journeys out of the body. That's how he met his wife. And there are many other. McKinley Cantor wrote a book called Don't Touch Me, where he wrote about interacting with his wife, who was in Los Angeles when he was in service in Japan. And I knew McKinley Cantor had a Pulitzer Prize winning book called Andersonville, and I knew him and his wife because my father published Andersonville. And Cantor said, yes, I could visit my wife, but she didn't like it because I would frequently show up when she was on the freeway because it was 12 hours difference when I was in Japan. So there's a lot of that going on. Aleister Crowley is famous for sex, drugs, and ESP. In his Confessions, he talks about all of his multitudinous out-of-body experiences. So this is not a unique thing. People who are interested in out-of-body experiences, but that's outside our program today, right?
Yes.
So here's Bob Monroe, friend of the program. Here's Pat Price, the psychic policeman, playing with my ESP teaching machine. And there I am in the corner waiting to see what Monroe has to say.
So Pat Price would use his psychic ability in his police work to help him solve murders and different cases like that?
That's exactly right. He came to us with a scrapbook of how he had solved many cases. He would sit in the station house, and if a crime was committed, he would visualize where the scared perpetrator was and dispatch a squad car to pick up the criminal. So he had a whole scrapbook of that kind of thing. So here is our number one remote viewing. This is first remote viewing, and many pictures that I'll show you were of this format. Pat and I are sitting in our electrically shielded room, and Hal, my colleague, together with Kit Green, would go to the laboratory office, have the secretary use a random number generator, choose one of 60 possible locations, and I didn't know even what the locations were. So I'm sitting with Pat in the shielded room. Hal and Kit went someplace, and I would sit with Pat and chat with him and say, okay, it's 3:00 now. Hal and Kit are at their location. What do you see? He said, I never did this before. I don't see a damn thing. So I thought, oh, that's a terrible way to begin this program. And the contract monitor is there. So I said, okay, Pat, Hal is driving his green Honda Accord. Why don't you just follow the Accord out of the parking lot and see where they go? This is the part that an interviewer is an integral part of remote viewing. Remote viewing is a non-analytic ability. You're simply seeing pictures in your mind, and to the extent that you ask questions about them, you're going to derail yourself. So my job is to be the analytic side. Your brain has two parts, an analytic part and a non-analytic part. The non-analytic part does ESP. The analytic part creates false images corresponding to your judgment. So my prodigious viewer says, I don't see a damn thing. So it's up to me. What can I do to save this experiment? I don't know where they went, so that's not my job. So I said, well, why don't you follow the car? And he said, oh, yeah, I see them pulling out. They're going south on Middlefield Road. I see them turning into a park. They're at what looks like a water purification plant. I see a round body of water about 100 feet in diameter. The rectangular body of water about 60 feet by 80, and there's two giant water tanks. That's what I see. It's a water purification plant. So I said, that's terrific. And he made the nice drawing on the right. So Hal and Kit Green came back, and we all went back to Rinconada Park, which was the target. And everybody was very excited that he had given the dimensions of the two bodies of water within a couple of feet. They were basically 100-foot square, 100-foot round, and 60 by 80, and that's what he said. But of course, this is a swimming pool complex. There's no water tower there. So our explanation was he saw the site and decided it was a water purification plant because he'd always been involved in city planning and so forth, and just made that up. But it was a great drawing, highly, highly accurate. Everybody was very happy. And that's a story I told for about a decade until about 1990, when Palo Alto celebrated its centenary anniversary. And we were all sent picture books. All of us living in Palo Alto were sent picture books of what the city looked like 100 feet ago, 100 years ago. And I'm sure your ESP tells you the answer. 100 years ago, Rinconada Park was a water purification plant, and their book showed those two water tower. They're I don't know whether, well, you're not going to see my screen anyway, so I don't have to point to things. So there's two large water towers that the city sent to us. They're 75 feet tall, and they would undoubtedly have been the tallest thing in the city of Palo Alto. So it's no doubt Price had no trouble seeing those. So he put those water towers at the top right of his drawing, just where they had been in the earlier incarnation as a water purification plant. So this gives you an idea that you have to make sure the person describes the target where the beacon people are standing and describe it as it is right now. So people were very excited with that. And the CIA said, you guys are wasting your time. Well, I want to go back a slide. And we did 9 trials like this with Price. And each couple of days, we would do a remote viewing trial, and he would describe it. And after 9 trials, we had them matched. That is, we would have the drawings that Price made together with his narrative compared with what the actual target looked like. And a perceptual psychologist had the job of looking at the 9 drawings and going to the 9 targets and matching them 1-to-1 as best they could. And he was able to match 7 out of those 9 in first place. So what that means is that if Hal had been kidnapped 9 days in a row, carried off by the terrorists, Price would have found him the first place he looked in 7 out of the 9 trials. And everyone recognized that was a highly amazing result. In fact, we published that in Nature magazine, which is one of the most prestigious journals in the world. And even Nature could accept remote viewing with that kind of data. Nobody had ever seen this kind of accuracy. And the reason is we were asking people to do a task which is doable. Hitherto, or previously, things had been centered around card guessing. I've got a circle, a square, wavy lines, a cross, or something else. Can you tell me which one I have? And the answer is you have a perfect mental memory of those 5 cards now, and it's very hard for you to separate your diaphanous image from the true card that's in the envelope. It's hard to separate the image from your memory. You've got a perfect memory of those things. Think of it as clubs, spades, hearts, and diamonds. I've got a card in my hand. Is it a club, a spade, or heart, or diamond? Well, first thing's going to pop in your mind, the ace of spades, because that's what the way we're conditioned. So if you know the target pool, it makes it impossibly difficult, almost impossible to do that. So people have tried to replicate our work and thought it would be cool. Why don't we show the viewer all the possible targets in advance? And that's a way of extinguishing the ESP because you create so much noise. So from a scientific point of view, we've become very skillful at reducing the noise by using real outdoor targets. Nobody knows what they are, so there's no noise in the system. All I tell you is that Hal has gone to an interesting place. I have no idea what it is. Tell me about the images that pop into mind. And you're doing that against a clear slate with no noise. And that was successful. That worked for a decade. And in this particular case, he got 7 out of 9 first place matches. The odds against that are 1 in 100,000, and Nature was happy to publish it. But the CIA said, well, the psychic hide and go seek is good for Nature magazine. We have problems we want to solve. We have actual targets that we'd like to get information about. And we will bring you the geographical coordinates of something, and we want Price to go there and tell us what's going on. And they did that. We went up to, I should tell you, the reason we're in a shielded room, you may wonder, is that in the beginning, I worked with Uri Geller. And Geller is quite a psychic fellow for doing mind reading and clairvoyance. He did not bend anything at SRI, but he's pretty psychic. And his mentor, Andrea Puharich, is highly intelligent physician, engineer. And we were afraid that Andrea had invented a hearing aid which puts a signal directly into your 8th nerve through glasses or through a tooth, perhaps. And we were worried that Andrea or one of Uri's friends might send him the answer. It's the radio in the tooth hypothesis. So we use the shielded room to separate Uri Geller from anybody who would send him a radio message. And it turned out that viewers liked being in the shielded room.
Now, what is the shielded room?
Shielded room is like a telephone booth covered with copper screening.
Ah.
And it was very highly shielded. It was part of other equipment at SRI. So in this case, Ken Kress, with our contract monitor, he was undercover, so it's only very recently that I can even dare to say his name. he gave me a slip of paper with coordinates on it, just numbers, didn't mean a thing. X, Y, 1, 2, 3, 4 north, 7, 8, 12 east, and that's it. So I read those to Price when we were in our little room, and he said, "Well, that's very interesting, Russ. I feel like I'm lying on a building, on top of a building, and this giant crane is rolling back and forth over my body. There's a huge crane, the 8-wheel crane, 4-wheeled on either side of the building. I better draw a picture of that." And in my illustrations, on the bottom right, you have Price's drawing of the crane, and on the left, you have an enlargement of the crane as shown in the illustration at the top. So Pat Price basically nailed the crane. He drew the thing as well as you could draw it if you were looking right at it. And they were extremely excited about that because, as you see, this is a secret photograph that is, it's now, of course, downgraded. We've got the program declassified. But at the time, this was a secret satellite picture that no one could have seen. So this was as secret as it could be. And Price had no problem drawing that. And CIA was very excited, a little worried about it, a little concerned about this guy who can see anything in the world. And the CIA is very obsessed with secrecy. They said, "Well, that's okay, but of course we knew that this was there, so you might have just been reading our mind."
Well, it's interesting that he was seeing it from the perspective of the rail. As he said, it's rolling back and forth over him.
That's right. That's where it came. He enjoyed lying in the sun, and he was right there with the crane. So they said, "Well, can you? We want to give you another target that we don't know anything about, and we want to know what are they doing in the building." So next day we went back to our shielded room, and Price said, "There are a whole group of men in white coats, and they're assembling a huge sphere. They're building a 60-foot sphere out of gores. And a gore is like an orange peel slice. And they're welding these steel gores together, 60 feet in diameter. They're having a hard time because the gores are so thick that they're having a hard time welding them." And this is from Semipalatinsk that Price was describing the 60-foot gores, and he described these in 1974. We never got feedback from these until 1977, when it was published in Aviation Week from declassified satellite pictures. So here's what the gore looks like based on the airborne pictures. And the important thing to notice here is that this was not published until 77, and Pat Price died in 1975. So this is a case you might often think, well, Price just looked in the future to see what the feedback looked like. He didn't get any feedback because nobody got to see this thing until 2 years after his death. One of the striking things, of course, is he didn't say they're making a sphere, but he was able to say specifically that it's made out of gores, as the Aviation Week picture shows. So the result of that is that the CIA said, "This guy is so psychic, we don't want him hanging out with the hippies in California. We're going to bring him back to Washington, because if we have somebody here who can read the launch codes for the missiles in the president's office, we want him to be working with us." So he went to Virginia to work with the CIA. And 5 months after arriving in West Virginia, Pat died mysteriously. And we don't know how that occurred.
Have you thought about remote viewing his death to see what happened?
That's a very good idea. We haven't done that. No autopsy was done. CIA sort of spirited his body away. I saw him in a memorial, so his body was intact and he was buried, but no autopsy was done, and we don't know his cause of death. But it's pretty mysterious. Because we know the CIA was worried about his prodigious ability. If you got somebody sitting in a cabin who can read anything on your desk and you work for the CIA, that's a pretty scary proposition.
Yes.
So just before Price left, my colleague, Hal Putoff, went on vacation. He had a free trip to South America. They flew him down to Colombia. And each day, Price was supposed to describe where Hal was on that day. This is more remote viewing. Pat Price and I are, it's like Bobsey twins. We're back in the shielded room. Hal has gone someplace, and one day Price would say, "It looks like a cathedral," and we know that he's gone to South America, so he has South American kinds of things. There's a cathedral. I see a market. I see a harbor. I see a volcano, and on day 5, Price didn't show up. So I'm in my little shielded room, a tape recorder. This is Russ Targ and Pat Price. This is trial number 5. And it seems like Pat is not going to come today. So I better do it because it's an important series. We don't want a hole in the series. So I just closed my eyes and said, it looks to me like he's at some kind of island airport. I see ocean at the end of the runway. There's sand and grass on the right and a airport building on the left. And that's what I get. So I made the drawing on the bottom here, and Hal came back with the photograph at the top. And we thought that was a remarkably sharp drawing. And the really good news about this is it shows that remote viewing is so easy that even a scientist can do it. So
Maybe you're more psychic than scientist.
That's right. You never know. But as we went on, this is 1974, so things are getting easier and easier. So I finally was freed up. I was sent on a journey across the country, and one of the places I stopped was New Orleans, and I bought a picture book of the city of New Orleans, tossed a die on the street to choose a target, and that die led me to New Orleans Superdome. The viewer here was Gary Langford, who was an SRI physicist, used to be at Lockheed, so he's a straight up physicist as I was. And the interviewer was Elizabeth Rauscher, who's my partner in trying to create a physics model to explain ESP. So Elizabeth was sold on psychic abilities, highly intelligent theoretical physics professor. Gary's a engineer in the box. And
now, was Gary, would you call him a skeptic, or was he open?
No, he's a lifetime psychic, but never did anything like this. He said he used to play baseball, and he was a valuable fielder because he always knew where the ball was going to be hit. So he was a demon outfielder, is what his credentials were. When he said he wants to do something with us, I said, "Well, what have you done?" He said, "Well, I was a demon outfielder." and we knew him. He's a very amiable guy. We just didn't know that he was psychic. So he's in the shielded room. Elizabeth Rauscher is outside saying, "Well, it's 3:00 now. Russ is at his site. What do you see? Can you make a drawing?" And he said, "Well, I see this damn UFO in the middle of the city. Do you think he's been abducted?"
Yeah.
And Elizabeth said, "Well, we don't know. It's always possible. Why don't you just draw what you see?" And he said, "Okay, I'll draw this. It's like a UFO on stilts." And then he made another drawing, which we show on the left, which turned out to be the parking lot of the Superdome, where you see all the entrances to the building on the left and the big dome on the right. And his 2 drawings very nicely match the 2 photographs that I brought back. And this is the first ever remote viewing for Gary. And he followed me as I went to New York and made a very nice drawing of Grant's tomb, nice drawing of the fountain in Washington Square Park. So he was quite a successful remote viewer with us as a walk-in.
you can adjust your viewing from any angle. You can see the target from above, or then you can change your consciousness to see it from the side. Is that accurate?
You can do that if an interviewer asks you to do it. Generally, a person comes in and sees what he sees. I can say, as a viewer, I'm happy to get an image of anything. So if I get an image of something, I will draw that and, like, I got the picture, don't move the camera. But indeed, if I, as you'll see in a minute, I was able to help somebody walk down a hallway and do all sorts of things. And here's Ingo Swan, who's really the father of remote viewing, together with Hella Hamed, who's a professional photographer, charming woman, highly intelligent, friend of the program, and had been my friend for a couple of decades. And we brought Hella into the program when the CIA wanted to see what would an inexperienced person do. We need an ordinary person who's never done this before. Now, it'd be a mistake to say that Hella was an ordinary person, but she had never done this before. And Ingo is the one who told us that you mustn't do card guessing. It's a trivialization of my ability. And he pointed out that the bicameral nature of the brain, half of it's analytical, half of it's pictorial. You want the viewer to deal only in the pictorial side and have the interviewer deal with the analytical side. And it's a two-person job. And he understood that the noise was due to memory, imagination, analysis, grasping, naming, or all sources. Don't try and name it. Just tell me what you're experiencing. So Ingo totally understood that from his lifetime as a psychic practitioner.
Fascinating.
So Hella was brought in. Hella's our inexperienced viewer, a newbie to the program. So we went up to a comfy room where she could lie down on the couch. And she said, "Okay, Russ, what do I do?" She's the first person that I interviewed where they had no idea what it was. And I just told her my shibboleth about quieting her mind, tell me about the pictures that appear. And she said, "Something's moving very fast." And that's drawn in the top illustration where she has the arrows. And I said, "Okay, let's take a break." Because I knew that I'm always thinking ahead, because I know that by and by a judge is going to have to separate out whatever she has on paper from 9 other targets, and her little arrow there won't do the trick. So I said, "Okay, let's take a break, a few minutes. Let's look again. Hal is still at his place. Does anything new come into view?" And she says, "It's very interesting. He's at a place that's sort of open, and there are holes in it. So it's like a trough in the air, but it's full of holes, so it wouldn't carry water." And that's her second picture. And I said, "That's very interesting, Hella. Those are good pictures. Could you kind of wrap it up? Can you give me an overall picture of what this looks like?" Thinking a judge is going to have to separate this from something. So she made this squares within squares illustration at the bottom. And I knew that we were done. I said, "That's terrific, Hella. Thank you very much. Let's get some coffee." And Hal came back, and he had been at this pedestrian overpass, which greatly resembles what Hella had drawn. So you begin to get the idea. Here we are, and I see there's no date on my picture. There's 1976. So we're now 4 years into the program. We're getting the idea that this kind of prodigious psychic ability may be much more distributed than we ever thought. And in fact, we did 9 trials with Hella, and she had 5 first place matches, 4 second place matches, and her overall score was 10 times greater than the most psychic man in the world. So Hella's overall score was significant at 1 in a million. And we published her findings in the proceedings of the Institute of Electrical Engineers out of 1 in a million. Now, I can tell you off to the side, when we first presented these data, Pat Price and Hella Hamid's amazing drawings as published objects, we took those to a society. The Parapsychological Association has an annual meeting, and Hal and I showed 9 pictures from Price and 9 pictures from Hella. People thought we were lying because those were so superior to anything that other people were seeing. Professional parapsychologists essentially said, who are these 2 physicists who just walked into parapsychology research, don't know anything about psychology, and they're doing 9 trials and have odds of 1 in a million, where we have to do 1,000 trials and we're lucky if it's significant at all. So they thought we were lying, or some of them did. Some of them we knew. So this is like too good to be true. So at the end of my career and Hella's career, 1981, Ken Kress came into our office. Hella and I were chatting, and he said, I've one more thing I'd like you to do. Can you take a look at Brezhnev's office in the Kremlin? So the target today is Brezhnev's office in the Kremlin. Neither of you have been there, right? And we laughed, of course. No, that's the last place we've ever been. So he said, okay, well, see what you can do. So Helen and I just went up to our comfy remote viewing room. She lay down on the couch and said, well, I'm walking down a long hall, and at the end of the hall, there's some red doors covered with leather. The red is held in place by upholstery tacks. It is very, very luxurious, ostentatious doorway that I see. And I say, well, can you see what's going on inside? And she says, no, the door's closed. And I said, okay, I see what I see. I'll open the door. And I pulled the door open psychically. And she said, well, I can see the door is open, but it's dark. And I said, all right, I'll turn on the lights. This is like a lucid dream.
Yes.
So I opened the door, turned on the lights, and she said, okay, I see what's going on now. There's an enormous wooden desk on the right covered with glass. And on the left side, there's a window open to Red Square. And I can see the big church with the onion dome on the side. So we got Red Square on the left, the big door on the right. And by the way, there's some doors in the plywood behind his desk. And I said, oh, good. Why don't we open the door and see what we get? And she said, well, there's stairs going down. I said, okay, we can go down the stairs. And she said, well, on the right, there's a big bank of computers. Bank of computers go all the way down sort of a hallway off to the right side. And at that point, I began to feel a little frightened. Like I have a lot of clearances. I have top secret clearance, but I have no clearance to be in the computer room in the Kremlin.
Did you feel like someone had detected your presence perhaps and was trying to track you?
Either someone detected my presence or it was paranoia. I felt very exposed. I felt like my consciousness was down there in the Kremlin, and we know that the Russians are interested in psychic stuff. So I just felt that Helen and I were very exposed in the bowels of the Kremlin. I said, well, I think that's a terrific description. Why don't we get out of here? And we terminated the experiment. And I left SRI because I wasn't able to publish any of the work that we were doing once we started working with Army volunteers. And I was invited 2 years later to give a lecture for the Soviet Academy of Sciences, which I did. And that turned out to be in the big ballroom of the Kremlin. And everyone was very excited and a little alarmed when I told them And what this shows is that there is nothing secret anymore, no more secrets. And to say that in the Kremlin at the height of the Cold War caused a lot of teacups to be in Russian lectures. Everybody's got a cup of tea. So you just hear all the teacups rattling when I said there are no secrets anymore. And they said, by the way, is there anything you'd like to see in the Kremlin? And I said, yes, as a matter of fact, I'd like to see Brezhnev's office. I don't need to meet the prime minister, but I'd sure like to see where he sits. And they took me down the hallway, and the red doors were just the way I show here, just as Hella drew them. And we went inside, the desk is on the right, and the window overlooking Red Square is on the left. So that was really shocking for me to see right after Hella had described that. And I do not recall now if there's doors behind the desk, but I probably wouldn't have asked to open them anyway.
Yeah.
But the red doors held in place by the upholstery tax were the high point in me. For what it was shocking when I walked down the corridor and saw those, just as Hella drew them.
Now, did you tell them that Hella had seen this 2 years?
No, of course not.
Yeah.
Now, this is an illustration that goes with what I see. You got to remember that Hella is our control person. Hella's the inexperienced control who brought in. We want to see what does an ordinary person do. So it really gives you quite an eye-opening view of what an ordinary person can do. In the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that my NASA contractor came to my office and met with Ingo Swann and me and said, we're about to launch Pioneer 2 spacecraft to Jupiter. Is there anything interesting that we're going to find? So Ingo took out his pen and paper and made this drawing, really quite he did this on a one sheet of paper as though this is really a formal remote viewing. He put his name and his date on the top, made a number of drawings, and you can see in the middle, he clearly draws the planet with a ring around it. And 8 months later, NASA came back and had the first ever description of ice crystals around Jupiter. So Ingo was able to look out 500 million miles and be the first person in the world to ever confidently say there's a ring around Jupiter. So the Army intelligence, INSCOM, the intelligence command, would frequently send somebody out to SRI to do a task, find a downed airplane, for example. The opening scene in our movie, Third Eye Spies, we have Jimmy Carter describing how the CIA asked us to find a downed Russian airplane in northern Africa because the satellites couldn't find it in the jungle. And one of our viewers was able to quiet his mind, mark a map, draw a circle, say it's the river, there's the mountains, between the river and the village, you're going to find the airplane coming out of the river. And the CIA sent a helicopter into Zaire, no permission, just flew in, and next to the river, they found the airplane full of code books. But the CIA, the point of my story is that the Army was tired of sending people to California. Like, I hate to send people out to the Oracle if I want to do something. Can't we do this ourselves? So we had a task to train some Army officers to become psychic. So Hal and I went to Fort Meade and had a chance to interview quite a large number. There are 30 Army officers, of whom we chose 6 to come and do remote viewing with us. These were all people who said, yes, they thought that they could do this. It made sense to them. They're willing to mortgage their career and come to California. The first person I worked with was Joe McMoneagle. senior warrant officer. So we sat at a table in our workroom, and I said, "Your major has gone to hide someplace with Hal. I have no idea where they are. What do you see? What comes to mind?" And he made a whole bunch of little drawings around the edge of the page. And I said, "Well, those are interesting drawings, but I think a judge is going to have a hard time with those. Could you consolidate those pictures?" He said, "Yeah, I think they're at a building that's very tall in front, like piano keys in front, and a long building behind, and a fountain in the corner." And he made the drawing that I show in the lower figure. And his major and Hal went to hide at the Palo Alto Art Museum. And this looked like a auspicious beginning for Joe. Very, very successful drawing. And 9 years later, our program was closed up. Ed May, who's another physicist, took over the program, moved to SAIC in Menlo Park, but continued the remote viewing program working with Joe. So CIA agent visited him and said, "I haven't been to see you for some time. I have an idea for an experiment to do. It's 8 o'clock now. I'm going to go drive someplace, and I'll be someplace at 10. And then, I'm going to skip the slide. Okay. And I'll be at someplace at 10, and then I'll be at someplace at 12. So I'd like you to make a drawing of where I am at 10 and where I am at 12. And at 10 o'clock, he was at the Ultima windmill farm and made the drawings that I show down below. He said there's some hills and there's something up on posts. There's something rotating on the posts as part of a grid. And he made this very nice drawing 100 miles away. And the next place he went to is Lawrence Livermore, our own atomic bomb factory. And I'm noting here to remind me that in our experiments, we did not have displacement. We did not have a decline effect. And all the card guessing experiments, even though people can start very good, they get worse and worse as they go along. It doesn't wipe out the effect, but it's very disappointing for people like J.B. Rhine to have this stellar card guessing person, and they all get worse. My purpose in showing this slide is you can see Joe's drawing of the building in the lower left. He said, "I see a 6-story building shaped like a letter T covered with glass." And that's what he drew. In the upper left, you see the 6-story building covered with glass. So there's no decline. It's very important that our people don't name the wrong target, which is called displacement, and they don't get worse. In fact, they get more discerning. They become increasingly able to tell the psychic signal from the mental noise. And I do also, as an interviewer, I can hear somebody say something in a tone of voice that just doesn't sound like ESP. I once did an experiment I described briefly with somebody who's sure that they could do that. And they say, "Well, okay, I'm ready. It looks like Macy's." And I said, "Please don't tell me about Macy's. Let's start over. That doesn't sound like remote viewing. That sounds like a guess. Just tell me what you're experiencing. What are you experiencing that makes you say Macy's?" And he said, "Well, I see a bunch of hangers all in a row." And he went on to make a drawing of the pedestrian overpass. If there weren't an interviewer working with him, he would be anchored to Macy's and it would just be a big fat miss. At that point, I was quite experienced, and Macy's doesn't sound like a remote viewing. Macy's sounds like a guess. So although I didn't know what the target was at all, no idea, but I knew that what he said didn't make sense. So we worked with these 6 Army officers, and we did 6 trials with each one. And you would expect to get 6 first place matches. You'd expect each of them to get 1 first place matches in his set. Each of the 6 did 6 trials. By randomness, you'd expect one of those 6 to be first place. So you expect to get 6 first place matches. We got 19 first place matches, which is again a score of 1 in a million for these people. All the good scores were with 4 of them. 2 of them sort of never figured it out. But the 4 who did well did very well, getting 6 out of 6 or 5 out of 6, did remarkably well. So my 6 random people, 6 inexperienced people from the floor of the gymnasium, 6 trials from 6 people gave a score of 1 in a million. And this, in fact, is the drawing I wanted to publish, and the Army wouldn't let me publish anything. And at that point, I left SRI. In this little dissertation, I have not left out a bunch of misses. In this experiment with the 6 people, 2 of them couldn't do it. 4 of them did extremely well. So in this experiment that I show in the chart, you see all the data we have significant at 1 in a million. So I left SRI and wanted to put this to some good use, and I created a company called Delphi Associates. And Delphi, of course, was an oracle, all-knowing oracle in Greece. And so I named the company the Delphi Associates, and we did remote viewing to forecast changes in the silver commodity market. And each week, once a week, we wanted to forecast whether silver would go up a little, up a lot, down a little, or down a lot. And my psychic I was working with, a very experienced psychic, Keith and I would sit at my kitchen table and say, well, the broker, John in Marin, has got some objects, and I'm going to show you one next Friday. Here we are on Monday. I'd like you to please tell me about the object I'm going to put in your hand next Friday. So I didn't say, do you think silver is going to go up or is silver going to go down? Both Keith and I kept ourselves ignorant of what the market was going to do. And so we did 9 of these guessing games each week. What am I going to put in your hand? 1 of 4 objects. And all 9 forecasts were correct. 9 out of 9, he was able to describe which of the 4 objects. And of course, each week they're different objects. It's like the broker would decide, well, today I'm going to choose my coffee cup, a leftover pancake, a flower, and a book. And I would say, Keith, what do you see? He said, well, it's a round object, has a funny smell, and is kind of floppy. I would say, well, that's a great description. So I'd call the broker and say, what have you got, John? He said, well, I've got a coffee cup, a flower, a book, and my leftover pancake from breakfast. And I said, it's a leftover pancake. What does that mean? And he said, let me look. He said, oh, that means down a lot. I said, okay, that means we sell silver. So that happened. We were selling silver at a time when the Hunt brothers were trying to drive it up. So this success, we made a huge amount of money on this one trial because we successfully went against the market. So we had no sense were we following the market. In fact, we made $120,000 and we're written up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And I should mention that the following year, we were not successful for a number of reasons, one of which is the broker wanted to do it twice a week, which meant that the viewer did not get feedback for trial 1 until after we did trial 2 and that was not a good idea. But this definitely worked, and there is now a whole industry of people forecasting sporting events in the market using remote viewing. This is called associative remote viewing and gave birth to a new industry. But of course, we didn't invent this. This was done initially in Delphi. And I've been to Delphi, and the Temple of Athena is just as it's shown here. The water is still bubbling out of the temple, so you can do your ablutions before you go and see the oracle. And the famous case, what drew me to Delphi, is a famous instance that Herodotus writes up in great detail, where the king of Lydia, King Croesus, was afraid of the Persians and was looking for an oracle. So he sent 7 messengers out to 7 oracles. And when the messenger of Croesus went to the oracle of Delphi, this is like a remote viewing. The messenger shows up, that's like the customer coming to SRI. And the customer doesn't get to talk to the priestess. The customer talks to the priest and says, "What do you want to know?" So the priest then goes to the oracle and says, I have a question from a customer. Will you quiet your mind and tell me what the answer is? I'm not going to tell you anything about the question. I just want you to tell me what you see. And the oracle says, I can count the words. I can see the ocean. I have ears that hear all that can be heard. Something striketh my nose. The smell of a shell-covered tortoise is boiling in a fire together with the flesh of a lamb, is brass above and brass below. So basically the oracle says, I smell somebody's making lamb and tortoise stew in a brass pot, brass above and brass below. So the 7 messengers went back to Croesus, and the messenger from Oracle had this story about Croesus in his courtyard cutting up a lamb and a tortoise, and that's exactly what he was doing. The king was in his courtyard cutting up the animals, throwing them in a brass pot and boiling them. And he was so excited that King Croesus caused 117 gold bricks to be cast, gold bars, and sent them to the Oracle of Delphi together with a gold lion to stand on them. And Croesus was there, and Herodotus was there to see the bars and the lion, and wrote this narrative 500 BC, 250 BC. So I don't have a firsthand drawings, but Herodotus is taken as a good witness, and since it's in such detail, scholars of that period think that this really occurred. William Parkes wrote as a Oxford scholar of the oracles, and he wrote the narrative that I saw, and he sent me to Herodotus. So I think this probably occurred. So this is so we didn't invent remote viewing. This is an early double-blind experiment because the viewer and the messenger, nobody knew what the answer was until you got back to Croesus. Now, an early writer on this subject is Padmasambhava, who's a great Buddhist guru, and he wrote a book very much like other books written by contemporary ESP researchers. He wrote a book called Self-Liberation Through Seeing with Naked Awareness. That sounds a lot like what we're talking about. And he wrote this 800 AD. And he said that your nature is timeless awareness. You're not limited by space and time. In fact, you're not limited by cause and effect, because your consciousness is outside of time. Therefore, time and effect, cause and effect don't affect you. So it's really quite amazing that somebody in the 8th century is saying your consciousness is outside of time, therefore you're free of cause and effect. So a very remarkable observation. And he said, as you're looking for timeless awareness or naked awareness, the main thing is to give up your desire to name and to grasp the things that you're seeing. You want to be free of naming and grasping. Naming and grasping are the enemy of timeless awareness, which is exactly what I'm telling people 1,200 years later. So again, the idea here is that remote viewing is not new age. The Greeks understood it. The Buddhists understood it at the time of Christ. And that's what we're pursuing now. And I encourage you to pursue this. And my last accomplishment is I produced this film called Third Eye Spies, which is a unique event in that we show the illustration that I show here, and we have our two CIA contract monitors, Kit Green and Ken Kress, are on camera saying, yes, the stuff Russ described actually happened, and it was even useful for the CIA. So that makes us and this is streaming at no cost to people who have Amazon Prime.
Our time is running out. I want to thank you for sharing your work with us today. And
well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to have the opportunity. What it shows is that if you live long enough, you get to do a lot of interesting things.
That's right.
And I'm very happy to have done this with you.
Well, thank you so much. You have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Good, thank you.